Rome began as a monarchy, but the kings proved to be tyrants and were overthrown. Rome then transitioned to a republic, but this was a very particular republic, an oligarchic republic, a patrician republic. In effect, the king's family was the top family in Rome, and the replacement for this system wasn't no elite families but many elite families. The patrician republic was led by Rome's top families, by those families there at the beginning of Rome. New families that later came to Rome found themselves in the plebeian class, kept out of the box seats. They were up against institutional nepotism, cronyism and privilege. If you scratched into the incendiary question of who runs America, you would discover that America is more or less ruled by the same families that ran America prior to the 1776 revolution and were prominent in that revolution. These dynastic families, the old money establishment, the patrician families, have been joined by the new money plebeians, who now regard themselves as patricians too, and have adopted all the same airs and graces. The elite Roman families exercised their power through the Senate, the governing body led by the male elders of the great families. Francis Galassi wrote, "The Senate also held the purse strings, and no public money could be spent without its approval. In addition, it functioned as a kind of high court, trying individuals accused of particularly heinous crimes, such as treason. The Senate included the role of Supreme Court." Familiar blocking tactics went on in the Roman Senate, such as the filibuster. Wikipedia says, "A filibuster is a political procedure in which one or more members of a legislative body prolong debate on proposed legislation so as to delay or entirely prevent a decision. It is sometimes referred to as talking a bill to death or talking out a bill, and is characterized as a form of obstruction in a legislature or other decision-making body." Francis Galassi wrote, "By law, all debate, though not necessarily a vote, had to be finished by nightfall on the day a motion had been introduced, and senators spoke on a motion in order of seniority. If you were good at public speaking, you could therefore talk a proposal to death by just speaking about it until sunset, or hiring someone to do it for you. Isn't it amazing that these silly tactics are still allowed to exist today? These tactics are designed to preserve the status quo, to maintain the establishment in power. But the Senate didn't exist in a vacuum. It was backed up by an assembly called the Comitia Centuriata. The assembly met each summer to elect the executive officials of Rome, the government, which was advised and often steered by the Senate. The assembly elected consuls, praetors and censors. There was also a second assembly called the Comitia Tributa. This elected the lower officials of Rome, such as quaestors and the aediles. Galassi wrote, "The consuls had supreme civil and military power. The praetors administered civil law, presided over the courts, and commanded provincial armies. The censors conducted a census on the basis of which they could appoint people to the Senate. Hence this was a vital role since it determined who got into the Senate. The aediles managed domestic policy in Rome, including controlling the markets and public gains. The quaestors were financial officers for the consuls in Rome and for provincial governors. The two consuls, elected annually, were the executive power in Rome. The Senate was the legislature and Supreme Court." Galassi wrote, "The election mechanism was important. In neither assembly did you vote individually. You voted as part of a group. This is an interesting concept, group voting. So, the group would first have to vote internally to determine who the group would then vote for externally. Some people in the group would find it voting for the opposite policy from what they wanted. How would democracy be changed today if were conducted in the Roman manner, via groups? It would be somewhat like the American electoral college system. The Comitia Centuriata was concerned with the military, with the people in arms. The Comitia Tributa was concerned with the Roman concept of tribes, which was linked to which part of the city you lived in. Each section of the city formed a tribe. Galassi wrote, "In the Centuriata you voted as a member of your centuria, the army unit into which you were enrolled, for life, at age 18. To be in the army you had to own at least a certain amount of property. The army was commanded in large part by patricians, and the Army Assembly typically voted for what the patricians and Senate wanted. It was distinctly conservative. The tribal assembly was much more chaotic and often represented the interests of the poor. But not well enough. The poor wanted their own assembly, hence the establishment of the comitia plebis tributa. So, the plebs established a separate source of power from the Senate, the tribunes, who often opposed the Senate. Can you imagine the USA with tribunes of the people, opposing Congress and the President and the Supreme Court? Dream on. The American powers that be would never allow the creation of tribunes, directly representing the interests of America's working class and poor. The USA is far more patrician than Rome. It has never ceded power to the workers, and it would brand any such attempt as evil, socialism, communism, or Marxism. You could never get the likes of the people's heroes Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus in the USA. It's unthinkable that the USA would empower the masses. America is in the bizarre game of pretending that no one is poor, or that poorness is a state of mind, or a choice, and that anyone could be rich if they just worked hard enough. The Americans bought this mindless propaganda and outright lies by American patricians. The Roman poor knew they needed someone to represent their interests. The American poor have never worked that out. They believe that patricians are going to do what is good for the people. How demented can you get? Suckers. Marks. Dupes. The people of the USA should compel Congress to establish tribunes of the people, say one for every state, with the power to propose their own laws, which must be enacted, and to veto anything proposed by the President, Senate, or Supreme Court. That would create a whole new America in an instant.